Nobody in that county ever thought a scrap of paper could start a massacre. On a gray afternoon in 1974, Harlan Eli Rutledge sat under buzzing lights in a concrete room, staring at a folded mill ticket like it was a loaded gun. Across the table, the sheriff waited, tape recorder ticking, but Harlan's eyes stayed on that slip, on the neat black numbers that proved what had been stolen from him. Decades later, that ticket sat in a cardboard box in an evidence vault, and it's where our story begins tonight. You're watching a man who worked the Georgia pines his life, a man who kept quiet while 9 others died around his method, his machines, his name. How did one slip, one weight, turn into burned rigs and bodies scattered through the longleaf? What did Harlan see in those numbers that nobody else bothered to read? Before we walk into those woods, I want you to tell me one thing in the comments. Where are you watching from? Out in the open air, far from that small concrete room, the story began a year earlier beside a pulp mill in South Georgia. Steam rolled from tall stacks. A siren wailed the noon change. Loaded log trucks rattled across a steel platform scale, brakes squealing, chains clanking. Men in hard hats moved like parts of a worn machine, each one hoping today's work would keep the bank away for one more month. Closer to the ground, red clay dust clung to boots and mud-splashed fenders. The mill yard spread wide and flat, a field of stacked pine bolts and long logs, all waiting to be turned into paper and profit. Trucks eased forward, one by one, to the low white scale house with its small glass window. A clerk slid slips of paper out that window all day, each one a number that could feed a family or starve it. Folks here did not talk about stocks or pensions, they talked about tons and loads. On that winter line sat Harlan Eli Rutledge in an old green truck, his son, Clay, riding shotgun. Their trailer sagged with fresh-cut pine from leased land down a washboard sand road. Harlan watched the rig ahead of them get weighed, then watched it roll toward the barking loader that would snatch logs and swing them toward the hungry mill. He counted seconds in his head, already doing quiet math. Time, weight, fuel, that was the real currency. The mill ran on a simple rule that felt both fair and cruel. You got paid by the pound. A truck rolled onto the platform full, rolled off empty, and the slip showed how much wood you had dragged out of the woods. Big outfits with shiny machines could haul more, faster. Little crews like Harlan's had to be clever or be crushed. Gas prices had climbed, rates per ton had fallen, banks were not patient. Every change in those black numbers on the mill slip dug at nerves across 3 counties. Inside the scale house, under humming lights, a young clerk in a company shirt hit keys on a gray adding machine. Each truck number, each weight, and each timestamp went into a logbook and then onto thin paper slips. Carbon copies stacked in wire baskets. When the day ended, all those sheets slid into long brown folders marked by crew name or truck number. That process seemed boring to everyone who lived it. To Harlan, those slips were quiet proof of something he had built with his hands and mind. Years earlier, he had started tweaking his old skidder and saw setups, shaving minutes off each turn, teaching Clay a pattern for cutting and dragging that packed more tons into a single load without tearing up the stand. The mill workers noticed that his truck, number 17-3, rolled across the scales heavier than most. The tickets piled up with better numbers beside his name. Some men in line saw that and felt respect. Others saw it and felt a slow, bitter envy. Nobody at the mill cared how a crew hit those weights, as long as the wood kept coming and the paperwork lined up. The company did not ask who had dreamed up which brace, which hook, which chain pattern. They looked at dates, crew codes, and totals. The rest lived in the dust and in the talk men shared at the fence during slow moments. Machines could be copied, tricks could be borrowed, ideas could slide from one crew to another with a nod. Harlan understood that truth, and it scared him more than the talk of rate cuts. When he stepped down from his truck after a long haul and took his slip from the clerk's hand, he did not crumple it or toss it on the dash like so many others did. He folded it neat, stuck it into his shirt pocket, and later laid it flat on his kitchen table under the yellow light. To most men, that paper was pay. To him, it was a record, a line of proof that the Rutledge way of working these pines was real, measured, and his. Stacks of such slips grew in a worn cigar box in a bedroom drawer back at the house. Dates, loads, and crew codes layered there like tree rings. No one in that yard guessed those numbers would one day sit in state agents and lawyers, or that they would help explain why 9 men died in the woods. To them, this was just another hard winter, another day of diesel smoke and waiting in line, hoping the next load would be enough. After the trucks left the mill yard, the day did not end for Harlan Eli Rutledge. His green rig crawled along the 2-lane road, past scrub oak and ragged fields, toward a patch of pines that carried his name, if not his deed. Clay sat quiet beside him, boots on the dash, watching his father's hands on the wheel. The boy knew that when Harlan's jaw set like that, talk could wait. Diesel hummed, loose chains rattled. The folded mill slip rode in Harlan's shirt pocket, pressed flat against his chest like a small, sharp stone. Their place sat at the end of a sandy lane, a clearing cut out of young pines and broom straw. A low house with peeling white paint leaned beside a tin-roofed shed. Old tires, worn chains, and bent saw blades lay in neat piles, not trash, but parts waiting for a second life. Farther back stood the Rutledge landing, a beaten patch of red dirt where logs once piled high and machines rested between runs. There, a skidder crouched like a metal animal, its blade and winch marked by scars that only Harlan understood. That skidder was no store-bought thing anymore. Harlan had welded on extra braces, moved the winch, and rigged longer chokers so Clay could drag more stems at once without digging deep ruts. He had filed saw teeth to a pattern he liked and taught his crew to cut at angles that wasted less wood and spared their backs. None of it looked fancy. To an untrained eye, it was just old iron, old tricks, old men chasing timber money. Yet every small change added weight to the loads that rolled across that mill scale. Inside the house, warmth and the smell of beans met them at the back door. Martha Rutledge stood at the stove, spoon in hand, listening for the sound of her men's boots. She watched Harlan lay his cap on a chair and reach into his pocket. The slip came out first. He did not hand it to her or toss it aside. He walked to the small bedroom, opened the top drawer of a scarred dresser, and took out a long, faded cigar box. Within that box lay months of other slips, each folded and stacked in careful rows. Behind them, a thin notebook held lines of numbers and short notes in his tight hand. Dates, truck weights, crew codes. Besides some, little marks that only he could read. A circle for a new brace tried that day. A star when a change worked better than he hoped. From another drawer, he pulled a sheet with a pencil drawing of the skidder's side view, arrows pointing at each brace and hook he had dreamed up. To Martha, it looked like scratches on old paper. To him, it was proof that the Rutledge way did not just happen. He slid the fresh slip into its place and shut the lid, slow and sure. Years before, in North Georgia mountains, Harlan grew up on stories of men who fought over landlines and moonshine haulers, not paper patents. His daddy taught him that a man's word and work were all he truly owned. Then the draft came. Korea burned that lesson deeper. In cold hills half a world away, Harlan learned to watch, measure, and plan. He came home with a back scarred by shrapnel and a head of quiet habits. Later, when the chance came to move south and cut for the mills, he saw another kind of war. Small crews against big outfits, old tools against new machines. He promised Martha, sometime between babies and banknotes, that he would build something no foreman or agent could take with a form or a shrug. Land was too dear. Cash slipped away fast. What he had instead was his mind for machines and the slow patience to test and fail until a better way of working the pines appeared in front of him. That method became his inheritance plan, the one thing he meant to hand his boys that might outlive rust and debt. He did not trust courts to understand such a gift. So he trusted paper he made himself. Neighbors saw only the outer man, the stooped logger at church on Sundays, the quiet driver in truck number 17-3, the fellow who nodded more than he spoke at the parts counter. They never stepped into that small bedroom at night and watched him spread slips and notebooks under a lamp, lips moving as he checked figures against memory. While Martha mended shirts and Clay cleaned chain, Harlan traced the rise of their loads across the months, line by line. He knew how far they had come from the first thin hauls. He also knew that any man with sharp eyes could watch his landing, copy his brace, count his chokers, and claim the trick as his own. That fear walked with him now, quiet but constant, a shadow beside the pride he felt when Clay eased the skidder just right. In that mix of pride and dread, the stakes of what might be stolen took shape, long before he held the first proof in his hands.
Morning came with thin frost on the truck bed and a list on the table. Harlan slid the paper toward his oldest boy. "Need that U-joint, couple teeth, and a length of chain. Boyd'll have it," he said. Clay nodded, grabbed his cap, and headed out, glad for town after days in the woods. Boyd Mercer's equipment yard sat just off the highway, a sprawl of iron under a sagging sign that read Mercer Logging Supply. Old skidders, loaders, and trucks lined the fence row, some for sale, some only good for parts. Men liked to hang there even when they had no money. Coffee steamed from chipped cups, radios played low. Boyd moved through it all like a fair boss at his own small kingdom. He slapped backs, called folks by name, laughed loud at jokes he'd likely heard twice already. Clay had known him since he was a kid. Boyd had stood beside Harlan at Clay's high school ball games, sharing a thermos and talking fuel prices. To Clay, he had always seemed like a friend, maybe even kin without the blood. That made the sight at the far end of the yard hit harder. A skidder stood there on fresh paint and new rubber, but the heart of it looked too familiar. Clay's eyes went first to the winch mount. It sat higher, welded to a brace that arced just so, the same odd angle his father had worked out one long night with a chalk line and a coffee can. The chokers hung longer than stock, with an extra link twisted near the bell. Even the small gusset plate on the blade, a crooked triangle of steel Harlan had cut by hand, was there in the same spot. Clay walked closer, boots crunching gravel. He ran a hand along the weld bead. It had the same ugly beauty as his father's work, solid and rough. A small plate on the frame showed the serial number. Clay didn't write it down, but he said it to himself twice, the way Harlan had taught him to hold numbers in his head. Behind him, Boyd's voice came easy. "Pretty thing, ain't she? Fella from over Wilkinson County's taking her out next week." Clay kept his hand on the steel. "Who set it up like this?" he asked. "That winch, that brace, looks a lot like our rig." Boyd grinned, not missing a beat. "Been tinkering on these things longer than your daddy's been down here," he said. "Loggers all over want this kind of setup now. Gotta keep up, right?" Clay felt his stomach go tight. "Thought my daddy dreamed this up," he said. He didn't mean it as a fight. It came out soft, almost puzzled. "Aw, kid, there's only so many ways to move wood," Boyd replied, smile thinning just a hair. "Ideas float around. What matters is who can put 'em to work. You want that chain or not?" Clay took the parts he came for, paid cash, and drove home with the image of that skidder burned in his mind. The welds, the plate, the long chokers. Each bump in the road shook his anger a little higher. He had never seen his father claim something that wasn't his, and now he had seen his father's work sitting pretty in another man's yard. At the kitchen table that evening, Harlan listened more than he spoke. Clay laid out the story between bites, trying not to sound wild. "It was the same, Daddy. Not close, the same. Even the brace on the blade," he said. Martha watched both of them, spoon still in her hand. Harlan's face didn't change much. His jaw set. His eyes went a shade harder. Inside, something heavy shifted. "You sure about that gusset?" he asked. Clay nodded. "And the winch mount, higher than stock?" Another nod. The room felt smaller. Later, after supper, Harlan took his notebook and the skidder drawing from the dresser. He added the serial number Clay had carried home in his head, writing it slow, then underlined it. Beside the little sketch of his brace, he wrote one new word: copied. Boyd, across town, locked his office and counted cash from parts and deposits, pleased with how fast his new system was catching on. He didn't think about who first burned their hands on those welds. He didn't look at any mill slips that carried the Rutledge name. What Harlan saw that night, bent over pencil and paper, was simple and sharp. The thing he meant to leave his boys had already walked out his yard and stood, smiling, in another man's yard. And now that theft had a serial number he could point to. Harlan went to bed late that night, with the serial number echoing in his head like a drill. He had written it once in the notebook, then again on the skidder drawing, pressing the pencil so hard it tore the page. Sleep didn't hold him long. Before dawn, he was up at the sink, washing his face in cold water, staring at a man who'd just watched his last good idea walk off on someone else's machine. By mid-morning, the Sunday sun sat low and pale. After church let out, Harlan's truck didn't turn toward home with Martha and Clay. Instead, he rolled slow down a rutted lane that wound behind the white clapboard building, past a scrub of scrub trees, toward the river. That spot had always been a place where men talked quiet, out of earshot of pews and wives. Baptisms had been held there years back. Now only beer cans and tire tracks broke the sand. He parked in the shade and waited, cap low, hands on the wheel. In his pocket lay another scrap of paper, this one holding only a few words: "Need to talk. After service. Down at the bend." He'd passed it to Boyd with a nod outside the front doors. If there was still honor between them, it would show itself there. Boyd came, right on time, truck crunching over gravel and pine straw. He stepped out smiling, as if this were just two old friends stretching their legs. His tie was already loosened. The good shirt he wore for church hung open at the neck. "Thought you might want to talk about that brace," Harlan said, voice flat. Boyd kicked at a stone. "You mean that rig Clay was fussing over?" he replied. "You know how it is. Folks hear one man's got a better way, they want in." "There was more than hearin' in that yard," Harlan answered. "You built that frame same as mine. You been sellin' it." Boyd shrugged, gaze sliding off toward the slow brown water. "It's just steel, Harlan. Ain't like you got papers on it. Everybody borrows. You did your share when you came off the mountain." Harlan let the insult pass. "You tell those boys whose way they're buyin'?" he asked. "You cut me in on it?" "Can't cut you in on what ain't real," Boyd said. The smile had gone thin now. "Look, I've got 9 crews lined up with deposits. Banks in on the loans, mills happy 'cause more wood's coming in. You want to gum that up over a piece of pipe on a blade?" 9. The number hung between them like another man. Harlan pictured 9 modified rigs crawling across pine sand, 9 crews dragging bigger loads under Boyd's name, 9 mill tickets that should have been Rutledge numbers.
He also pictured the sheriff's office, the blank face of a clerk reading his story, then shaking her head because no law said a man owned an idea welded onto old iron. "What if I went to court?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Boyd laughed, a short, dry sound. "With what? A sketch in a notebook? Judge'd tell you to be glad your stuff works. You can't call dibs on gravity." In that moment, Harlan made a choice he'd never walk back. He decided the courthouse was a dead end. He decided talk was done. If he couldn't stop the spread of his method by rule, he'd stop it by force. And if he was going to hang for it, he'd make sure the record showed why. He drove home on the dirt road without speaking, dust lifting behind the truck like smoke. At his kitchen table that afternoon, while Martha folded laundry and Clay oiled a saw in the yard, Harlan opened his cigar box and notebook. He wrote 9 buyers on a clean page, then listed the little he knew: counties, bank names, Boyd's phone number. Beside the words, he drew small boxes for serial numbers not yet gathered and left room for dates. In another pad, he copied his diagrams cleaner, labeled parts, and noted the first days the mill slips had jumped. Piece by piece, he began building something new and cold, not a machine this time, but a trail of proof to set beside whatever blood was coming. When the pages in his notebook held boxes, not words, Harlan set his pencil down and listened to the house. Martha folded shirts in the next room. Clay hummed over his saw outside. Somewhere in the pines, a man who'd bought Boyd's new system was still dragging wood, happy and blind. Harlan knew which one would be first. Nearest name on his list was Joe Dobbs out of Wilkinson County, a small-time boss who liked cheap whiskey and loud bragging. The rig was leaving the yard soon. That gave Harlan days, not months. He loaded his truck with tools that looked harmless enough and drove out before dawn to watch Joe's crew work. The landing sat at the end of a deep sand road, ringed by tall pines and brown slash. Diesel smoke hung low, chains clinked each time the skidder rolled in with a drag. Men shouted over engines. Joe's skidder, fresh from Mercer's yard, gleamed under what light slipped through the trees, its brace and winch mount a mirror of Harlan's own. From the cover of brush, Harlan watched and waited. He saw how Joe's man set chokers wrong, wasting the design. He muttered, "You're killing it," though no one heard. When the crew broke for supper, leaving the iron parked and warm, Harlan stepped out long enough to read the frame plate. He whispered the serial number until it stuck. Dark came early under those pines. Last truck bumped away. Joe's men left the machine sitting alone, nose toward the road like a sleeping dog. Crickets took over where engines stopped. Harlan sat in his truck down the line and waited for one more sound to fade, the echo of voices from a far trailer, then silence. He walked in without a light, feet learning the ruts by memory from the day. Grease smell rose from the warm winch. He opened a small toolbox not for guns, but wrenches and a hacksaw. 2 quick cuts weakened the main pin on the chokers. A nick in the brake line promised trouble once weight pulled hard on the next drag. Back at his truck, Harlan lifted a long case from behind the seat. The rifle inside had gone overseas with him once, then ridden years in his closet. He checked the scope, loaded slow, and walked to a rise that looked over the landing. When Joe came back alone in his pickup, cursing late work, Harlan settled behind the gun. Joe climbed onto the skidder, started the engine, and set a fresh drag. Metal screamed as the weakened pin let go. The chokers snapped wild. The machine lurched where the line had been nicked. Joe grabbed for a lever, thrown off balance. In that wild sway, Harlan squeezed the trigger once. The report cracked through the trees, folded into the roar. Joe dropped without a shout. The skidder idled on, then rolled, nose down, into a pile of brush. Flames caught fast where fuel leaked and pine trash waited. Harlan watched long enough to be sure heat would warp metal past easy study. Before he left, he walked the ground, picked up the brass casing, then thought better and set it back down. On the drive home, his hands shook once on the wheel, then went still. At the kitchen table, he opened his notebook to the waiting page. He wrote Joe's name, the date, and the skitter's serial number, then drew a small circle to stand for death. Out in the woods, firemen and a lone deputy rode toward the flames, thinking it was only another bad accident.
News of Joe Dobbs' accident rolled through the Pine Belt faster than any truck. By the next night, men who'd never met him were telling the story over beer as if they'd stood right there in the fire. They said his skidder jumped gear. They said a hose blew and sprayed diesel over hot metal. They said bad luck follows a man once he starts running load counts up too fast. On the edge of the highway, where log trucks lined the ditch at dusk, a low cinder block bar glowed neon red against the dark trees. Inside, smoke curled up to stained ceiling tiles. A jukebox hummed under the talk. Sawdust and spilled beer stuck to boots. This was where crews came to forget the grind and to measure each other with side glances. Harlan nursed a single drink in the back, hat brim low. Clay sat closer to the door with other young men, catching pieces of every story. The name Dobbs rose and fell. Laughter ran around the room when someone said Joe always did have more guts than sense. Near the bar, a heavy man in a mill cap leaned in. He cooked that rig clean, he said. Heard the whole thing lit up like a match. Another voice cut in, lower. Coroner says he had a hole in him too. Sheriff's girl from up Piney Creek, Lila May, she told my cousin, bullet in the shoulder. Fire just finished what somebody started. That quieted the room. Harlan watched the men shift, eyes sliding toward the door, toward the thought of dark woods and hidden rifles. Someone snorted, trying to break the spell. Folks hear backfires and call them bullets all the time, he said. Crews push junk too hard, that's all. Clay stared down at his hands, knuckles white. He knew his father had been out late the night before. He knew there'd been no word of a breakdown on their own tract. That knowing sat like a stone in his gut. In a corner booth, Red Collier, Harlan's oldest hand and sometime driver, studied him. Red had swung saw and run truck beside Harlan for almost 10 years. He'd watched the Rutledge loads climb, had eaten at their table, had held Clay when he was small enough to ride a hip. Tonight, Red saw something new in the old man's stillness. It wasn't calm, it was distance. When Harlan left, he did it without hurry. He stepped out into the cool night, the sound of trucks rolling past on the highway a steady growl. Red followed a minute later, catching him by the cab of the green rig. "Harlan," Red said, voice kept low, "you hear what they're saying in there?" "I heard noise," Harlan answered. Breath steamed between them. "Noise about a bullet," Red said. "Noise about a man in the trees knowing that pin was weak." Harlan met his eyes without flinch. "You think they're talking about you?" he asked. Red shifted, scuffed his boot in the gravel. "I think I've run that old rifle out to your back field. I think I know you ain't scared of hard things, but I don't know if I can ride with it if that's what this is now." There was a long beat. Engine noise and neon buzz filled it. Harlan could have lied. He could have laughed it off, called the stories bar talk. Instead, he said nothing at all. Silence did the work. Red lifted his hands. "I got girls at home," he said. "I can't be in a truck folks point at when some lawman starts laying pictures on a table. I'm taking a spot with Frank's crew. Pays worse, but I sleep easier." No anger flashed in Harlan's face, only a tired acceptance. "You do what you need to. Owe you for a lot of miles." They parted there, one man walking toward a different boss, the other climbing into a cab that somehow felt smaller. An ally had slipped away, not in a blaze, but in a quiet parking lot under buzzing lights. Back home, the house lay still. Martha had gone to bed. Clay's room door stayed shut. At the kitchen table, Harlan opened the cigar box, took out his notebook, and added 2 more lines. One marked Joe's name with the word bullet beside the date.
The other noted Red's leaving, as if loss of a hand was another kind of cost to tally. He thought about that murmur in the bar, the way one stray remark from a deputy could bend the story of Joe's death. If men could twist things that easy with talk, then paper and numbers had to be tighter. He pulled a page from the back and wrote Dobbs fire, coroner, gunshot, and underlined it. Later, when state men came asking, he wanted his own account to line up against theirs, not drift like rumor smoke in a noisy room.
Rain set in before daylight, a thin, steady fall that turned red dirt to slick clay. Harlan woke to the patter on the roof and the weight of his notebook on the chair beside the bed. Joe Dobbs's name looked lonely on that page, one circle where 9 were meant to sit. If he was going to finish what he'd started, he needed more than Boyd's brag and a guess. Across town, First County Bank opened its glass doors to a line of men in work boots. Fluorescent lights hummed over tan walls and framed farm scenes. The air smelled of paper, old coffee, and fear. Folks came here when they wanted to plant, to buy a truck, or to beg another month before the note came due. Behind a wide desk sat Mr. Weldon, the loan officer, hair neat, tie straight, ledger never far from his hand. In the middle of that line stood Harlan, hat in both hands, jeans damp at the cuff. He had told Martha he was going to see about the note, which was true enough. Their own payment on the skidder loomed large. Yet a second purpose pulled him there. He wanted to see which names Boyd had tied to his copied rigs, which families were now hitched to stolen work. When his turn came, Weldon waved him into the office with a polite smile. "How's the woods?" the banker asked. Harlan sat, eyes flicking once to the desk where a short stack of folders lay open. On top, in blue ink, someone had written, "Mercer, Equip," and beneath it, a list of last names, Dobbs, Mercer, Hanley, Price. The letters were plain. The meaning was not. Talk about his own payments filled the first minutes. Weldon asked for updated numbers. Harlan answered steady. Under the words, he counted letters, shapes, placing each name in his head. When Weldon reached for a calculator, the folders shifted, and another tab showed, R. Mercer Logging Unit. A small chill ran along Harlan's neck. Ricky, then. Boyd's boy pulled into the web same as any stranger. Outside, rain tapped the window. Through the glass, a young woman sat in an old car, hands folded over her belly. Ricky's wife, or so rumor had said. She watched the bank door with tight eyes, every so often checking the rear view to see if children in the back seats still slept. That sight pushed against the picture Harlan had drawn of buyers as faceless thieves. Here was a family tied to the copied brace just as his own was tied to the first one. Weldon slid papers across the desk for Harlan to initial. "Tough season," the banker said. "You keep hauling like you do, we'll see you through. Course, Mercer's new system's given some of these boys a boost." He tapped the folder stack without thinking. "They're counting on that iron holding up." No reply came from Harlan for a long breath. At last he said, "That iron breaks. Who's the bank come after?" Weldon blinked, then shrugged. "Notes got their names, not the machines. You know that." The rules were simple, and they cut only one way. Back home that evening, dry again, Harlan opened his notebook to the page marked 9 buyers. He added the surnames he'd seen in neat print, leaving space beside each for serial numbers, dates, and whatever else he might learn. Beside R. Mercer, he hesitated, pencil hovering, thinking of the young woman in the car and the unseen kids behind her. A small doubt moved through him, not about Boyd, but about the reach of his own anger. These men had borrowed to buy an idea. Their wives had not. Their children surely hadn't. Yet every note, every blue ink name on Weldon's pad sat there because Boyd had offered Harlan's method as a ladder out of dust. If he knocked that ladder away, they'd all fall together. Still, on the last line, he wrote a sentence plain and careful.
Loans at First County prove Mercer sold our brace and line as his. The bank's neat ink would later help agents and lawyers see the pattern. For now, the only eyes on that page were his, and the ledger he was building had 2 columns no banker could balance: stolen work on one side and living souls on the other.
Harlan closed the notebook and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The names on the page seemed to lean toward him, each one asking what came next. Outside, the rain eased, leaving the house wrapped in a wet hush. He could hear Martha in the kitchen knocking pans together, and Clay's boots on the back steps. The sound of their lives went on. His mind did not. The list would not shrink by itself. If he stopped now, Boyd's stolen rigs would keep crawling through the woods. In the days that followed, Harlan moved like a man working 2 jobs. In the daylight, he cut his own tract, hauled his own loads, kept Clay and the crew fed. After dark, he watched roads and landings, one buyer at a time. Some he scared off the machines and shot in the confusion. Others died when weak pins or cut lines turned weight into fire. Each time, before he slipped away, he bent close to twisted frames to find the serial plate and say the numbers under his breath. Back at the house, Harlan added circles to his page: 4, then 6, then 8. The names blurred after a while, but the pattern stayed sharp. Every dead man had bought a rig from Boyd, had signed his name on a banknote that tied him to that brace and winch. Only one circle was left empty, waiting for Ricky Mercer. Harlan tried not to picture the young wife in the car or the children he had never met. He failed. The thought sat with him like a nail in his seat. Ricky's death came on a foggy morning when the world felt half erased. His truck had broken down, so he was running a loader for another buyer on Boyd's list. Harlan watched from the tree line as the loader swung heavy tops to a waiting truck. When a hose, nicked the night before, burst under strain, slick fluid spread under Ricky's boots. The next log rolled wrong. Metal lunged. In the scramble to hit the kill switch, Ricky slipped and fell where the boom came back. The blow took him fast. No gun needed. That night, Harlan sat alone at the table while Martha slept and Clay lay staring at his ceiling, knowing without being told that one more man was gone. The rain had stopped, but the house still felt damp. Harlan opened the notebook, drew the last circle, and wrote R. Mercer beside it. Below the 9 names, he drew a hard line and added one more entry, his own. Beside it, he did not put a date, only one word: soon. By his count, the work in the woods was over. Now he turned to the other kind of work. He cleared the cigar box and sorted the mill slips by month. He taped some to notebook pages and marked the days when his new brace first pushed their loads higher. Next, he copied his hand sketches of the skidder and sawheads, slower this time, with neat labels even a stranger could follow. Each page showed that the idea had lived with him long before Boyd's sales. This was the spine of his proof, built from cheap paper and a sharp pencil. On a cold morning, he carried all of it into a law office off the square: slips, sketches, and a stack of photos of his rig. The lawyer, Mr. Givens, watched in silence as Harlan packed them into a metal toolbox, locked it, and slid over a note that began, "If I am taken in." Mr. Givens read the first line of the note, then looked up. "You expect this to come to pass, Harlan?" he asked. Harlan nodded once. "When they pick me up, you hand 'em that box. State man, not just locals. Don't open it yourself." His thumb brushed the cool edge of the metal lid, then left it. The lawyer slid the toolbox under his desk, more out of habit than trust, already feeling the weight of something bigger than liens and wills. From the square, Harlan's truck rolled 2 blocks and stopped in front of the sheriff's office. Fluorescent tubes buzzed inside. A wanted poster sterned on the bulletin board when he opened the door.
Lila Mae Daughtry looked up from her desk, surprise tightening her features. Before she could speak, he set his hat down and said, "I'm here to give myself up." What followed in that small room, the long, flat telling of 9 names and 9 tracts of pine, sent deputies scrambling for radios. By afternoon, tan cars with blue lights were cutting through back roads toward every burned rig that had been written off as bad luck. Where volunteer firemen had just soaked smoldering frames and gone home, now yellow tape went up. The air still held faint smells of resin and old smoke. Investigators stooped by twisted metal, scraping mud away from frame plates, reading serial numbers into cheap tape recorders. One crew walked the blackened landing where Joe Dobbs had died. Char streaks climbed the trunks, aluminum puddled on the ground. A deputy pointed with his pen. "This the one they said was just equipment failure?" he asked. The GBI man with him, Agent Thomas Llewellyn, nodded and wrote "Revisit" beside the case number on his pad. Word from the sheriff's office was clear: treat every burned machine like a killing ground. Sun dropped as they worked scene after scene. In Wilkinson County, a loader's boom lay skewed like a broken arm. In another tract, a skidder sat nose down in a ditch, winch cable snarled and frozen. Each site told the same rough story: too much damage for simple age, too much fire for simple chance. Llewellyn didn't yet know what tied them together, only that his gut said they did. Back in town, phone wires hummed. At the switchboard office, Evie Daughtry watched little bulbs wink as calls passed through her hands. She had heard enough from Lila Mae to guess what Harlan had confessed to. She also knew, in a way city men might never grasp, what it meant when a man's way of working was stolen. The secret sat hot in her chest until she couldn't hold it. On her break, she stepped into the empty hall, lifted the receiver, and dialed the GBI field office. When a bored voice answered, she kept her own low. "You got burned logging rigs in 3 counties, right? Start writing down the serial numbers. Then, you go look at Mercer Logging Supply's sale books. Every one of those machines came through Boyd Mercer, and that brace on the blade, that's not his, it's Rutledge's." The agent on the other end straightened in his chair. "Ma'am, who is this?" he asked. "Doesn't matter, but you write this down. This all starts with a stolen design." Before he could press her, she hung up, palms slick. Llewellyn heard about the call 10 minutes later. A pink message slip dropped on his desk. He read the words twice: stolen design, serial numbers, Mercer. None of that had been in the sheriff's first report, which read like the work of a mad logger lashing out at random. Now a different shape emerged, one cellar at the middle, one pattern of metal. He drove back to the evidence board and began pinning paper. Each burned rig got a card with its serial number. Each card got a string to Boyd Mercer's name. Off to the side, he tacked up a copy of an old mill ticket someone had faxed from the plant. Truck number 17-3, crew name Rutledge, weight circled high. Under it, he wrote 3 words in block print: original high yield. Viewers looking at that board years later in grainy documentary footage can see the moment the case shifted. The story stopped being only about fire and bullets. It became, in the eyes of the state, a fight over a way of working wood, mapped in numbers and metal plates.
Agent Thomas Llewellyn stood in front of the big corkboard as the room settled into a late-night hush. Cards with serial numbers, county names, and dates covered the wall. Red string ran from each burned machine to one name in the middle: Boyd Mercer. Under that, another card waited, still pinned with one tack: Harlan E. Rutledge. On a metal table behind him lay copies of reports from the fires, each stamped first as accident and now retagged as homicide. Photos showed twisted frames, warped braces, and the same strange gusset plate on more than one blade. None of that proved who first dreamed that plate up. It did prove the iron had moved through one man's hands before it reached 9 dead buyers. At the far end of the evidence room,
A young tech sorted a stack of green bar printer paper. These were toll records the phone company had rushed over after the anonymous tip. For long-distance calls, the system wrote down numbers, times, and lengths on tape, then fed them through a big machine that spat out lines of digits. Now those lines lay in front of Llewellyn like a second forest. He ran a finger down the list until he found Boyd's business number. Every time it appeared, he drew a circle. From there, he traced sideways to the other numbers on each row. One belonged to Joe Dobbs's house, another to Ricky Mercer's trailer. More linked to scattered farms and small offices in 3 counties. The dates lined up with sale contracts already in his file. When Evie Daughtry walked into the field office to answer questions, she saw that board for herself. The sight made her throat go dry. She had grown up with some of those last names. She had dialed those numbers for folks who wanted to check on a truck or a sick cousin. Now here they hung as markers in a chain that led from a stolen brace to 9 graves. Agent Llewellyn asked careful questions. "How long you kept these call records?" he said. "Who else has access?" Evie, fingers twisting a handkerchief in her lap, told him about the tape reels in the back room, the way they got boxed and sent to storage after a few months. She admitted she had pulled some early when she heard Harlan had turned himself in. That confession put a shadow over her, but it also saved the trail from being erased. Later that week, Llewellyn drove to First County Bank with a folder under his arm and a court order in his pocket. Mr. Weldon, pale but polite, brought out loan folders tied to Mercer's equipment sales. Each told the same story in blue ink and stamped dates. Buyer's name, serial number of the rig, Boyd as broker. The agent copied those numbers, matching them to the fires and to the phone calls. At the pulp mill, he walked through the scale house and asked for old load tickets. The clerk, nervous, opened deep drawers where slips lay in long metal trays. Truck number 17-3 showed up again and again. Heavy loads, the crew name Rutledge typed neat. Then months later, new crew names under Mercer-sold rigs began to appear with similar big weights. The Rutledge way had spread long before anyone in law enforcement had heard the phrase. Back at the field office, a state computer the size of a closet hummed as technicians fed in punch cards. They coded each serial number, each call, each loan, each ticket. The machine did what chalk lines and guesswork could not. It spat out a simple printout showing one common center: Boyd. Above him, in an earlier band of dates, sat Harlan's crew, the first to hit those high weights. Llewellyn wrote a memo that night. In it, he laid out a theory. Boyd had taken Harlan's method, sold it to 9 men, and in doing so threatened the only thing Harlan saw as his true property. Harlan, in turn, had answered that quiet theft with open blood. When our team pulled that memo years later for this episode, it was already scanned, clean on a laptop screen. If you're still with me and you want to see how this evidence plays out under oath, you might hit subscribe before we step into that courtroom. The paper, the calls, and the iron are about to meet the law, and nothing about it will feel simple.
Morning in town broke slow and sticky, the kind where flies found the diner windows before the coffee even finished brewing. Down on Main, the Blue Plate Cafe filled with loggers, mill hands, and bank clerks, each one clutching a mug and a copy of the paper with the same bold line across the top: Georgia Pine Forest Murders tied to equipment deals. Chrome napkin holders caught the print and flung it back in crooked reflections. Plates clinked. Bacon hissed on the grill. Nobody talked about ball scores. Every eye that dropped to the news saw the same names: Harlan Eli Rutledge, Boyd Mercer, 9 dead men, and a line about a disputed logging method that made the whole room hum. At a corner table, 3 old hands from the mill sat side by side, reading aloud in turns. One traced a finger under the ink. "Says here state boys found identical custom braces on every burned rig," he muttered. "All sold through Mercer's yard." Across the aisle, a younger driver snorted. "Brace didn't pull no trigger," he said. "Rutledge did. That ought to be enough." On a stool near the counter,
Ricky Mercer's widow, hair pulled back tight, stared at the little black letters that spelled her last name. Her plate of eggs went untouched. The article said Ricky had benefited from stolen industrial know-how. It did not mention the overdue light bill on her table or the babies who asked where their daddy had gone. She folded the paper small, like she hoped that might crush the words. Lila Mae Daughtry slipped in for coffee on her break, badge clipped low under a sweater. She heard her own last name once in the story, tucked into a note about a deputy who helped reclassify early accidents as homicides. That made some heads turn her way. She kept hers down, but her ears stayed open. From a corner near the window, a thin woman with mountain vowels still in her speech spoke up. "Y'all forget who came down here first with that way of dragging wood," she said. "Harlan's people been working that pattern since Mercer knew which end of a saw to hold." She tapped the photo where Harlan's mugshot sat. He's wrong for the killing, but Boyd was wrong first. Across from her, a man in a bank shirt shook his head. "You can't just start shooting folks over a brace," he answered. "If he had a problem, he should have come here, talked with Weldon, got a lawyer, something." He jabbed a thumb at the paper. "World can't run on backwoods rules forever." Another logger at the counter chimed in, voice rough from years of smoke. "World don't run on nothing but what men let pass," he said. "You steal a man's way of feeding his young'uns, that's more than just business. Where I'm from, you better look over your shoulder." The waitress, wiping a sugar spill, tried to cut the heat. "Paper says state found phone logs, loan notes, all that," she shrugged. "Sounds like they got the theft part on record now. Maybe that'll help his boys later, even if he never sees daylight again." Lila Mae heard those words and thought about the toolbox under Mr. Givens, the one Harlan had told her, in his flat drawl, would explain the rest. The article talked about anonymous tips, about call records, about serial numbers. It did not yet mention the neat diagrams and old mill slips she knew were sitting in that metal box, waiting for a courtroom. At the far end of the room, a preacher from Piney Creek ate his toast in silence, eyes on the same headline. He knew families on both sides of the story. He'd prayed over Ricky's coffin and over Martha Rutledge's tight-lipped grief. The article's neat paragraphs made it look like cause and effect, like lines on a map. In his mind, it was more like a knot nobody could pull apart without tearing the rope. As forks slowed and folks drained their cups, the talk split clean, almost down the middle. Some said Harlan was a menace who'd turned grudges into graves. Others said the mills and banks had pushed men into corners where old codes felt like the only law left. Everyone agreed on one point. After this, nobody in 3 counties would look at a new piece of iron without wondering whose idea really lay under the paint. That confusion, that back and forth in a small diner, was part of Harlan's plan, even if he never stepped through those doors. The paper had picked up the words stolen design and original method. His name now sat beside those phrases in print. The killings would send him to a cell, but the question of who owned that way of working the pines had slipped out of back rooms and into public sight where no one could stuff it fully back down.
On the morning they brought Harlan Eli Rutledge up the courthouse steps, the air felt too bright for the kind of talk running through town. Sun hit the brick front of the building and flashed off the glass doors. News vans from Macon and Savannah lined the curb, cables snaking across the sidewalk. Men who'd spent their lives in the woods shaded their eyes and watched something they'd only seen on television, their neighbor in chains. The sheriff's car stopped at the curb. When the back door opened, Harlan unfolded himself slow, hands cuffed at the waist, ankles chained just enough to shorten his stride. He wore the same work shirt he'd had on the day he walked into the jail, but now it carried a big black inmate stamped across the back. A deputy took his elbow, more for show than need. Harlan did not fight. Cameras clicked, microphones pushed forward. A young reporter called out, "Mr. Rutledge, did you kill those 9 men?" Another shouted, "Was this revenge for stolen equipment?" Harlan's eyes lifted once, not toward the lenses, but over them to the far edge of the square where he could just see the roof of the First County Bank, and beyond that, a scrap of sky over the pines. On the top step, Sheriff Haskins held up a hand. "That's enough," he said. "We'll have a statement inside." He turned half toward the reporters. "Mr. Rutledge has been charged with 9 counts of murder. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation is also looking into possible fraud and theft matters connected to equipment sales. That's all we got for now." The words fraud and theft made pens move fast. To the crowd, it sounded like the state itself now admitted that this mess started with something more than bad temper. Lila Mae Daughtry, standing by the door in her deputy's uniform, watched faces shift. Some looked pleased, like an old wrong was finally being named. Others looked puzzled, not sure why talk of braces and mill slips belonged in the same breath as murder. Inside the cool lobby, the noise dropped. Tile echoed under boots. A small knot of suits waited near the metal detector. In their middle, carrying a square, dull toolbox by its handle, stood Mr. Givens. When Harlan passed, their eyes met for a heartbeat. The lawyer gave a bare nod, then stepped toward Agent Thomas Llewellyn. "This is the box he told you about?" Llewellyn asked. Givens set it on a side table, slid over the key, and signed a quick receipt. "His papers, diagrams, mill tickets, says it's the story behind the story," he answered. They opened it in a side room off the hall, away from the crowd. Inside lay neat stacks of folded slips bound with rubber bands gone brittle. Beside them sat a Spyro notebook full of tight pencil lines, each one dated. Under that, clear photos showed Harlan's skidder and saw heads from different angles. Arrows and numbers marked the brace, the winch mount, the chokers. Every detail Evie's tip and the computer's printouts had suggested now sat in front of the agent in Harlan's own hand. Llewellyn lifted one mill ticket, Truck 17-3, heavyweight, date 3 years before Boyd's first sale. Another slip, same rig, same pattern. In the notebook, beside those dates, Harlan had written short notes. "New brace today. Shifted winch. Load jumped." The record wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. It tied the idea to him long before Boyd's loans and phone calls. For a moment, the power in the room tilted. Outside, Harlan waited in a holding cell, wrists sore from steel. In here, his quiet, stubborn habit of saving paper now steered how the state would explain the case. Without these pages, the killings might have looked like madness. With them, they became a brutal answer to a traceable theft. The agent felt that difference settle on his shoulders. Down the hall, the courtroom filled. Martha Rutledge sat in the second row, hands clenched around a tissue she hadn't yet used. Ricky's widow took a place near the back, jaw tight. Men from the mill, from the woods, from the bank lined the walls. When deputies led Harlan in, shackles clinking against the floor, a hush fell. The judge read the charges, voice flat. 9 counts of murder, arson enhancements on several, weapons charges. "How do you plead?" he asked. Harlan's lawyer rose. "Not guilty to the specific charges, but we will be showing this court how a long pattern of economic theft and misappropriation of Mr. Rutledge's unique logging method resulted in these events." A ripple went through the gallery at those words. The judge rapped his gavel once. "We'll sort all that at trial." Bail was denied. Dates were set. Papers shuffled. Yet for everyone in that room, something had already shifted. The state now held Harlan's body. His story, backed by the same kind of records mills and banks lived on, had slipped into their hands too. Whether they liked it or not, they would have to tell it, along with their own. By the time the trial started, the story that had walked up those courthouse steps with Harlan had swollen into something larger than any one man. Reporters had dug through land deeds, school records, and old mill logs, stitching bits of his past into dramatic columns. Folks who had grown up with him barely recognized the man they read about, part monster, part wronged inventor. Inside the courthouse, though, the noise fell away, leaving the dull scrape of chairs and the tick of the big clock. Jurors filed into their box, some with sawdust still on their boots, others in suits borrowed just for this week. Harlan sat at the defense table in a plain shirt and county khakis, hands free now but resting heavy in his lap.
Across from him, prosecutors stacked thick files, each tab a name from the notebook in that steel box. The state opened with fire and blood. Photos of burned landings flashed on a pull-down screen, one after another, until the jurors looked down rather than at the images. Witnesses from each county talked about the nights machines went up, about sirens on back roads and the smell of resin and fuel. Lila May testified in a tight voice about reclassifying accidents as homicides after Harlan's confession in that small interview room. From the back bench, Martha listened to every word as if it were a blow no one could see. When it was the defense's turn, Mr. Gibbons did not deny what Harlan had done. He stood by the projector with the toolbox open on a cart and told the jury they needed to understand why. One by one, he put Harlan's drawings on the screen, the side view of the skidder, the odd brace, the shifted winch. He pointed to dates in the notebook that matched early mill tickets, long before any of Boyd's buyers signed loan papers. Agent Llewellyn took the stand next, more teacher than cop now, walking the jury through charts that linked serial numbers, phone calls, and fires. He showed how every burned rig had first passed through Mercer's yard, how each buyer had called Boyd again and again before the checks cleared. He laid Harlan's old mill slips beside later ones from other crews, the weights almost twins. The room stayed very quiet as those papers moved from his hands to the evidence table, thin as they were. On cross-examination, the prosecutor circled Harlan's drawings like a hawk, asking whether he had ever tried to patent the brace or sell the plans. Gibbons answered that poor men in the woods did not speak the language of patents, only of load counts and trust. When Harlan finally took the stand, the jurors leaned forward as if a log they'd watched float downstream all their lives had started to speak. He told them, in his slow, mountain-flat drawl, how he had built the brace to save his back and feed his sons. He admitted the killings without flinch, saying he had taken it too far, but also saying that nothing else would have stopped the spread. The prosecutor pressed him. Did stealing an idea justify 9 deaths? Harlan stared at the rail of the witness box and said it didn't, then added that men still had to answer for what they took. After 2 days of testimony and 1 long night of argument, the jury came back with guilty on every count, no mercy recommendation. The judge sentenced him to life, but also openly stated for the record that Mercer's business had exploited Rutledge's unprotected design from the start.
Bailiffs fastened the chains back on his wrists as soon as the judge spoke. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Harlan, cutting off the low murmur that followed the words, "Life in prison." In the narrow hall, paint peeling in long curls, he felt the weight of the sentence settle on his shoulders like a second set of irons. Yet another line from that hearing stuck sharper than the rest. The judge's note, for the record, that Boyd Mercer had built a business on Rutledge's uncredited design. The prison bus waited in the alley, white paint streaked with dirt. Steel mesh covered the windows. Harlan climbed the steps slow, chain between his ankles scraping metal. As the bus pulled away from the square, he watched the town slide past, the bank, the diner, the edge of the mill roof. Past that, only the tops of pines showed. He could not see the landings where the burned rigs lay, but he knew where they were, like scars under a shirt. Intake at the state prison stripped a man down to numbers. Guards clipped his hair close, took his clothes, slid his calloused hands onto ink pads to roll prints. A clerk read off his new ID and typed it into a rattling machine. Another officer handed him khaki pants, a shirt with his number stamped above the pocket, and a thin blanket. "You're in C block. Keep your head down. Work when they tell you." None of that surprised him. He'd been told what to do before, in another uniform. Days blurred into a tight loop of counts, chow lines, and the hollow clang of doors. Harlan swept hallways, then later fixed leaky sinks and broken fans on a maintenance crew. The guards learned he could make stubborn machines behave, same as he had in the woods. Some called him Logger, others said Rutledge with a half-curious tone, the way men named a story they'd heard but didn't quite believe. He answered when he had to, but most of his words went onto paper. Letters came from Martha on thin prison stationery. Her handwriting wobbled each year. She wrote about Clay starting his own small crew under a different name, about grandbabies learning to walk, about the mill changing contract rules after all that testimony. "They got your brace in their paperwork now," one line read. "Folks call it the Rutledge rig, even when they cuss it." She never said she forgave him. She never said she didn't. Harlan wrote back in short lines. He told her to keep every copy of every ticket with their name on it. He told Clay in a separate letter where to find the extra diagrams Givens had not put in the box. "Don't build it just because I did," he warned his son. "But if you ever do, make 'em sign your name when they pay." Those letters joined the toolbox in the court files in a paper trail that pointed one way. This way of cutting and dragging started with him. Years folded over each other. His hair went white at the temples. Knees that had once climbed steep hills on the far side of the world now ached on concrete stairs. One afternoon, a lanky boy with Clay's eyes sat down across from him in the prison visiting room, plastic table between them. The buzz of other families' talk filled the air, along with the faint smell of burnt coffee. "You must be Eli," Harlan said, voice rough. The boy nodded. "Daddy says I ought to know where our name comes from," he answered. His hands were big, but still unsure. From a manila envelope, Harlan slid out a sheaf of clean copies, simple drawings of the brace, the winch, the chokers. At the top of the first page in his block print, he had written, "Rutledge method. Do not sell without your name on it." He pushed them across. He said, "That's it. What they killed and what I killed for. You read it, you remember it, but you don't ever pull a trigger over steel." Eli traced a finger along one arrow. "They really stole all this?" he asked. "They took it like it was air. Paper is what says it was ours. Courts got some, lawyers got more. You keep these." There was a pause, a small, shaky breath. "You do better than me with it." Decades later, after Harlan died in a narrow prison bed, those pages sat in a fireproof box in Clay's house. The mill's internal manuals listed a Rutledge-type brace as standard on certain rigs. A regional forestry journal ran an article about the controversial Rutledge system and its bloody history. In every file, in every footnote, his name rode beside the method. The price of that credit was a concrete cell, a family with holes where men should have been, and a story that could never be told without blood. On the far edge of town, where the pavement broke down into ruts and sand, Ricky Mercer's old single-wide still sat crooked on its blocks. The trailer's white skin had faded to chalk. A kiddie pool lay upside down in the yard, half full of leaves. Wind pushed at a thin curtain that didn't quite cover the front window. Inside, years after the trial, Ricky's widow Carla spread a stack of envelopes on the chipped Formica table. Power bill, past due, note from the school about lunch money, a letter from an insurance company, neat logo at the top saying one more time that Ricky's policy didn't cover acts of intentional violence, so the children would get no payout. The Massacre had a clean line in their files. Her life did not. 2 kids played on the floor with plastic trucks, pushing them through a maze of imaginary mud. They didn't remember their father's laugh, only stories. Sometimes they asked why their granddaddy's last name showed up in old news clips on late-night TV. Carla kept the answers short. Folks did wrong, and then more folks did wrong back. On that gray afternoon, the pastor from Piney Creek knocked twice and stepped in when she called. He still wore the same frayed black coat he'd had the day they buried Ricky, though his hair had thinned. He set a grocery sack on the counter, beans, rice, a small pack of meat, and sat at the table with care, as if the chair might not hold much more weight from anyone. "I brought this," he said,
And I wanted to see how you were getting on." Carla gave a tight smile. "We're standing up. Bills don't care who's dead." She nudged the insurance letter with a knuckle. "They say because it was murder, we don't get what Ricky paid for. Says right there in print." The pastor read the line, jaw working. In his worn notebook, the same one he used for sermon ideas and hospital visits, he wrote a date and a short note. "Mercer widow denied benefit due to homicide ruling. System protects company, not children." Over the years, pages like that had filled the little book. He had entries for Dobbs's wife, who'd moved in with her sister 2 counties over when the house note called in. For a boy from another family who'd gone mean with drink before he turned 20. For Martha Rutledge, whose grief had settled into her bones. Martha lived now in a small rental near the highway, the old Rutledge place long since sold to catch up on taxes and debts. Clay visited twice a week, his hair more gray than black, hands still rough from running machines. On her coffee table sat 2 things she dusted more than anything else: a framed school photo of Eli and a slim forestry journal with a bookmark halfway through. The article on that marked page carried a dry title, "Operational Efficiencies in Southeastern Pine Harvesting," but inside, a whole section talked about the Rutledge brace and the Rutledge method, drawing diagrams very much like the ones Harlan had pushed across a prison table. The author mentioned tragic events linked to disputes over credit and ownership. Martha ran her fingers over her husband's name on the page. "They finally spelled it right," she told Clay one evening, voice soft. "Took 'em near 30 years and 9 graves." Clay looked away. His own small outfit used different rigs now, off the shelf, no special braces welded in the yard. He'd turned down an offer from a machinery company that wanted to license the old design for heritage branding. He'd taken instead a quiet settlement from the mill after their lawyers admitted in writing that Harlan's work had been foundational. The money paid off Martha's medical bills and set a little aside for Eli's schooling. It didn't touch the empty chair at every Rutledge gathering. Families of the other dead men scattered or stayed and bore it. Joe Dobbs's widow moved to a mill town in another state where no one knew his husband's name. One of his boys dropped out of school and followed fuel work along the interstate, telling folks his daddy died in a woods accident and leaving out the rest. Another went to community college on a small grant that a state victims fund had set up after the trial, a fund that also, quietly, put a little towards Ricky and Carla's children each year. The Mercer clan carried their own stain. Boyd's name, once a kind of currency in equipment yards, turned sour. His brother lost business just by sharing the surname. Old friends crossed the street to avoid awkward eye contact. Ricky's kids learned to answer when asked if they were one of those Mercers, with a shrug and a quick change of subject. Decades later, when a researcher from a state university came through to gather stories for a book, the pastor pulled his worn notebook from a drawer. He laid it open on the table, letting pages of short lines and dates speak for the families more clearly than memory alone. Those notes joined Harlan's toolbox papers and the court files in a growing stack of records. On paper, the Rutledge line had won its name on the brace. In kitchens and trailers and small rental rooms, victory felt thinner. Children grew up with a legacy they hadn't asked for, one built from clever steel, old pride, and the echo of shots in the pine woods.
Years slid by, softening some memories and hardening others. The pine belt around the old mill town did what it had always done when storms passed through. It bent, it dropped a few limbs, and it stood back up looking almost the same until you stepped close. On the highway outside town, more trucks than ever rolled past, taller and faster, hauling wood not just to the old pulp mill, but to chip plants and pellet yards that had sprung up farther downstate. Some rigs carried company logos no one in Harlan's time had seen. Others still belonged to small outfits, names painted by hand on the doors. To someone looking quick, it was just logging, still. Inside the main office building at the mill, the air had changed more than the view. Where a wooden counter and a battered scale house once marked the center of power, now a second-floor conference room held the town's future in neat binders and glowing slides. Fluorescent light shone on a long, polished table. Around it sat company managers, lawyers, an insurance adjuster, and a safety officer who'd just finished a thick report. On the wall behind them, a screen showed a title in blue letters, Risk Review, Rutledge Mercer Incident and Subsequent Policy Changes. Beneath it, smaller text listed dates and case numbers. Someone had turned Harlan's bloody winter into a bullet point lesson. The safety officer clicked his remote. A slide came up with a grainy black and white photo of an old skidder, Harlan's original. Arrows pointed to the brace and winch mount. Another image showed a modern machine, factory-built, with a similar brace now welded at the plant. As you can see, the so-called Rutledge configuration has been standard in our suppliers' designs since the late 80s. Our concern today is not that shape, it's how we manage credit, contracts, and who controls modifications on leased equipment. He flipped to a page from an internal manual, highlighted text reading, "All design changes or field modifications must be documented and approved in writing." In red underneath, "No exceptions." After the Rutledge Mercer case, we tightened these rules. No more handshake deals on special setups. No more brokers making side arrangements without paper. That's helped. Claims are down. Liability is clearer. The insurance adjuster, gray suit, tired eyes, nodded. Also, she added, our policies now spell out what happens when a worker dies in a crime. In those days, we hid behind exclusions. Families like the Mercers got nothing. The press hit us hard on that. Now, we carry a separate rider for third-party violence so kids aren't left out in the cold when grown men do stupid, cruel things. At the far end of the table, a younger manager frowned. We still got small crews out there running with old iron. They're welding their own braces, making their own fixes. We tell them to bring rigs in for inspection, sign the forms. Some do, some don't. You can't regulate pride out of a man with a torch. The lawyer flipped open a thick folder. Inside lay copies of the trial transcript, the GBI memo, and pages from that state forestry journal. We don't have to regulate pride, we just have to regulate our response. This company cannot be seen as looking the other way again while people fight over ideas in the dirt. If some crew claims they invented a change that boosts our output, we put their name on a form, pay a bonus, and lock it down. Cheaper than a bloodbath. Down in town, the changes felt patchier. The diner still set plates under the same fan that rattled when trucks rumbled by. The bar still glowed red in the evenings. Men still met at the parts counter to complain about fuel prices and rates. Yet there were subtle differences. Load tickets came with barcodes now and scanned as trucks rolled by. The scale house sent digital files to a regional office instead of stacking paper in drawers. Call logs lived on servers instead of tape reels. When an old hand leaned on the counter and said, "You remember when nobody cared whose brace was whose?" The clerk, barely 30, shrugged. Company'd fire folks for that now. They got whole teams for innovation management. You want to tweak a rig, you got to fill out 3 forms. He rolled his eyes, but there was a kind of relief in his tone, too. Fights over credit had a place to go besides the riverbank and the rifle cabinet. Still, some things did not budge. Poverty clung to the edges of town the way resin clung to bark. Trailers still sagged. Kids still left for the army or the city when they could, or stayed and took whatever work the woods or the mill offered. Pain pills and cheap meth had crept in where shine once ruled. Feuds shifted from braces to overtime lists and layoff lines, from who stole whose method to who stole whose hours. The Rutledge name held a strange double weight. To young foresters and safety men who'd studied the case in trainings, it meant that brace that got folks killed.
To local crews, it meant an old story about a man who'd gone too far defending what he saw as his. In company manuals and state reports, Harlan's careful records were footnotes that nudged policy in drier language. On porches and tailgates, his tale still came out in low tones, half warning, half grudging respect. Systemic change came in memos, in manuals, in a few small checks written to widows' kids. It had not cleaned the red clay, nor made the pine woods kinder. It only wrapped the old hunger for control and credit in clearer rules, hoping that the next man who felt something stolen from him would find a better door to knock on than the one that led to fire and gun smoke in the trees.
From that hope for a better door, the story walks us up a hill where no doors exist, only stones and wind. The cemetery sits on a rise of hard ground just beyond the last houses, where the pines thin and the soil turns pale. Old oaks mark the edge. Below, you can see the gray roof of the mill, and farther out, dark blocks of timberland patched with clear-cuts. It looks almost peaceful if you don't know what those trees have heard. Near the middle of the graveyard, 4 stones draw a rough square. One bears the name Harlan E. Rutledge with 2 dates and a small engraving of crossed pines someone paid extra for. A few yards away lies Boyd Mercer, no symbol, just letters and numbers, and the word Father. Between and beyond them are headstones for Joe Dobbs, Ricky Mercer, and others whose names filled the GBI memo and the court docket. Standing there, the record feels different than it did in files and charts. Nothing about it is tidy. The men who died are not sorted by fief or avenger. They rest by who could afford which plot, by whose people claimed their bodies first. Grass doesn't care who welded the brace. It grows the same over all of them. If you trace those names with your eyes, you can see 3 systems laid over one another like faint maps. The first is the oldest, the personal code Harlan carried out of the mountains and the war. In that world, a man's way of working, his recipe for moonshine or method for cutting wood, was as sacred as his land. Courts didn't protect it, neighbors did, or punishment did. When Boyd took Harlan's design and sold it like any other part, he broke that unwritten rule. In Harlan's head, that breach counted as an attack on his very self. The second system is the one the town lived in every day. Banks, mills, and talk. Loan forms, load tickets, rumors at the parts counter. That web pulled 9 men into debt on rigs they thought would save them. It also helped Harlan prove after the fact that he hadn't imagined the theft. Every signature on a Mercer equipment loan, every fat ticket from a copied rig backed up what his notebook said. Yet the same system denied widows their insurance, raised rates, and moved on. The third system sits farther away but weighs the most now. State law, corporate policy, digital records. That's where Harlan's tech countermeasure finally landed. His diagrams, slips, and notes, folded into police files and trial exhibits, turned a private grievance into a documented pattern. Decades later, we can pull up scans of that toolbox on a laptop. Companies can cite the Rutledge case in training manuals. Investigators can follow his paper trail in seconds with search bars instead of filing cabinets. So, did he win? His name is on the method now in articles and internal memos. Mills and insurers changed some rules. A small scholarship fund carries his surname beside Boyd's in tiny print. A grandson holds clean copies of the brace drawing with the warning to never pick up a gun over steel. In that narrow sense, the tech countermeasure worked. It stopped the story from being told as senseless madness. It nailed down who created what and who exploited it. But the Hill says something else. Credit did not bring Joe or Ricky back. Policy changes did not restore Martha's house or Carla's sleep. Paper proved Harlan right about the theft and did nothing to make him less wrong about the bullets. His own line thinned out, 1 son alive, a few grandkids, no land with his name on the deed. The legacy he killed to defend lives mostly in copies,
factory braces, scanned files, training slides. That's the cruel knot at the heart of this tale. A man who feared erasure chose the one path that guaranteed he'd lose everything but the story of how far he went to stop it. The systems around him, banks, mills, and courts, gave him no clean way to guard an unwritten craft. His answer, born from pride and hurt and a lifetime of being told to fend for himself, turned a quiet theft into a massacre that still divides his community when the subject comes up. When you stand on that hill and look down at the chimneys and the thin strip of highway, the question that lingers isn't whether Harlan was justified. It's whether any world that pushes men like him to choose between silence and gunfire can really call itself just at all.
In the present day, the story lives in pixels and playlists more in whispered bar talk. A camera points at a plain desk. Behind it, shelves hold binders, a model skidder, and a framed black and white photo of a pine landing from the 1970s. On the desk, under the soft wash of studio lights, lies that same folded mill ticket you saw in Harlan's hands at the start of this episode, now flattened, scanned, its numbers glowing on a monitor just out of frame. On another screen are grainy shots of burned iron, the GBI corkboard with red string, copies of Harlan's diagrams from the toolbox, and a still frame from his testimony. A cursor hovers over a file named Rutledge_evidence_box.pdf. One click opens years of his careful habits, mill slips, notes, sketches. Where once they slept in a drawer and a steel box, now they sit on servers and in backup drives, one corrupted disk away from vanishing, one shared link away from reaching a million homes. Out past the town, down a sand road that hardly shows on GPS, the old Rutledge landing has gone quiet. Vines twist through the tracks of a rusting skidder. The brace on its blade is still there, pitted and flaking, the triangle of steel eaten but not gone. Teenagers use it as a backdrop for photos sometimes, not knowing much beyond something bad happened here once. Eli Rutledge, grown now, came out one autumn to stand beside it with his own boy. He ran a hand along the cool rust and remembered the prison table, the copies his grandfather pushed across, the warning not to pick up a gun over steel. His son tugged at his sleeve, more interested in a frog at the edge of a puddle than an old iron. Eli smiled, took a picture, and later that night told the boy as much of the story as a child could carry without losing sleep. Back in town, the diner still serves eggs under buzzing lights. Some mornings, a forestry student from the university drops by with a laptop, working on a thesis chapter about the Rutledge brace and informal innovation. At another table, a retired mill hand sips coffee and mutters that nobody needed a thesis to know you don't steal a man's way of feeding his kin. At the bank, new loan officers skim mandatory training slides that mention the case as a caution about undocumented improvements. Farther away, in living rooms you might recognize, over worn carpets, beside framed school photos and folded quilts, women in their 50s and 60s watched this very video. Some grew up with fathers or uncles in similar woods, or in mines, factories, mills. They know what it is to see a man's skill turned into someone else's profit, to watch systems smile at ideas and shrug at people. The names here may be new to them, but the shape of the hurt is not. That's why Harlan's tech countermeasure matters even beyond his story. His slips, his sketches, his notes, combined with Evie's phone logs and Llewellyn's charts, forced powerful folks to put in writing what they'd rather have left to rumor, that something was taken from a man who had no good way to defend it. The evidence did not save his freedom, and it did not raise the dead, but it did stop the world from filing this under senseless violence and moving on. The question that hangs now is what you do with that knowledge. If you strip this tale down to its cold frame, you have a man whose only real legacy was an unwritten craft. Law had no box for it. Companies saw it as free gain.
A partner turned it into cash. In answer, that man built his own box of paper and numbers to prove the theft, then chose the worst possible way to enforce his claim. The tech he trusted both cleared his name as creator and fixed him forever as killer. So, sitting where you are, maybe in a small town not so different from this one, maybe far from any pine woods at all, ask yourself, if someone stole the one thing you meant to leave your family and every door you knocked said that's just how it is, how far would you go to set it right? Would you swallow it and hope time told the truth? Would you fight in court you couldn't afford? Would you walk the path Harlan walked, knowing where it ends? There isn't a safe answer here, only honest ones. If this story stirred something in your own memory of a recipe, a trade, a song, a way of working that almost slipped away, tell it in the comments. And if you want more long, hard looks at cases where legacy, pride, and blood collide, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because out there, in hills and hollers and flatwoods across this country, there are other Harlans and Boyds, other quiet thefts and loud reckonings, waiting for someone to decide what they're worth and what price is too high to pay.